One thing, though, as good as our modern clocks are, they can never, ever be absolutely correct. That's because time itself isn't absolutely constant. It changes in the strangest ways. A man named Albert Einstein made sure of that.
I am talking about traveling through time in a machine constructed for that very purpose.
If the notion of traveling through time in machines seems impossible to you, just stop and think for a moment. Think how far we've come, traveling through space in machines. We've sent probes past Saturn's rings and onto distant stars. We've worked in orbit above the Earth, setting the stage for manned exploration of the solar system. We've even left our footprints and tire tracks in the dust of the lunar landscape. Now just imagine how impossible all of that would have seemed 80-odd years ago. Fake, 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 fake.
Have you ever really thought about time and the idea that humanity has stolen credit for something that God built into the creation in a way he didn't have to do but chose to do by creating the luminaries? If day and night existed before the sun, the moon, and the stars were created to govern them and to mark the times and the seasons, God could have just as well created us in a world that had no natural indicator of how much time was left in the day or the night. I don't even know if this is making any sense. I've been thinking about this for a while now, and going back to Joshua's long day. Joshua 10, starting in verse 12. At that time Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There has been no day like it, before or since, when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. And it's interesting too, I found a blog post talking about Joshua 10 and how indeed there are recorded myths and oral traditions from cultures all over the world that describe either a long day or a long night or a long sunset, depending on where you are in the world. And I thought that was really interesting. But it makes, kind of makes you stop and think about it. But for me, it also kind of helps illustrate the point, because it makes me curious, like how would you even know, if the sun and the moon were standing still, and the stars presumably, how would you know how long you'd been fighting? And I presume there would be numerous ways to come to a fairly general, calculation. They had water clocks and candles that were made to burn at unified times. But of course, all of these mechanisms, the earliest clock, of course, being the sundial, but if the sun's not moving, the sundial's no help. You would have to turn to other natural processes, and that's, of course, what time is explained as through, a Big Bang cosmology, is just sequences of events. It really is inseparable from the concept of motion. Interestingly enough, if you just imagine everything being frozen in place, not just the sun and the moon, but everything, every natural process, every human being, like you see in a sci-fi movie where somebody has a device and they can freeze time, freeze motion. How would you even know how long, how would time, if you only had yourself as a reference point, then that would be really difficult indeed. But it really kind of comes back to begging the question of what is time? And when there is no creator in your cosmic questioning, then indeed time is something that was just born at the Big Bang. It's as fluid as everything else because it didn't come from the mind of a creator. There was no intention behind it. There was no design behind it. It's just an extrapolation of whatever the laws of physics are, which themselves are fluid. And so, from a cosmic evolutionary standpoint, time itself is a social construct, right? Certainly, solar years and days of evening and morning and one day after another, and weeks and months and years, solar years, that's just a construct of our perspective of a tiny fraction of the age of, the 14 billion year universe. So even though we measure the universe in Earth years are just a subjective unit that we humans came up with because we crawled out of the evolutionary tree enough to notice the patterns of the sun and the moon going overhead, and then began to measure everything else in relation to that in terms of time in our evolutionary process. And the thing that started me really thinking about this was this silly TV special from 1985 with Michael J. Fox talking about the time machine in science fiction and movies, and they interview all these science fiction writers talking about time and time travel, and it's just kind of it's a real gem. I hadn't seen this before. But they, in this one section, they talk about how they're talking about Einstein and all this nonsense, but it kind of just made me realize that, time itself, according to Genesis, is something that God created even before all the components that we now associate with them were even created. He created day and night before the sun and the moon and the stars. And that alone is a pretty profound kind of thing to ponder, that the concept of it came first, and that somehow there was light and dark before there was the quote-unquote sources of the light. Whereas Genesis just says they were there to govern the day and the night. And this is kind of one of the main, revelations, I suppose, of considering ancient biblical cosmology, enclosed, flat, whatever the dome's made out of, or the firmament or whatever. Just the basic concept of these things not being these giant things millions of light years away, but being put above our heads as this big celestial clock that for thousands of years human beings were depending on all over the world. And it wasn't even until the 1500s and 1600s that they started making mechanical clocks that were, used for various things. And as the development of that advanced and the timekeeping became more precise and everything, that itself facilitated so much of what we would call the process of industrialization. If you don't have, there's a lot of technologies and industries and things that would have been very difficult to implement in the way that they were without, basic mechanical timekeeping. But the point being that, we look at that and go, oh yeah, look at how advanced we are. and forgetting the fact that, like, we had the clock in the sky for thousands of years before we ever... I mean, can you imagine not having that? It's a pretty handy thing to be able to, even without a sundial. You know, you don't really need to go make a sundial to be able to look up in the sky and kind of tell what time of day it is. But if we didn't have that, can you imagine? How would we even try and figure out mechanical, if it took us that long to make our own clocks? If we didn't have one over our heads that was moving, except for that one specific day, that one day that was unlike any other day, the one time where God stopped the clock. And, you know, obviously time kept going, but the celestial timepiece being under God's control, because He's the one who put it there in the first place, after the earth was formed, not at all in the order that a Copernican solar system would seem to require. But anyways, I just never really thought about the idea of deconstructing time as an evolutionary construct, as some arbitrary, development of our species that, it's interesting when you look at a lot of the stuff I found talking about the history of timekeeping. It typically mentions the Assyrians and the Babylonians and their development of the hexadecimal system based on 60, which can be divided into, prime numbers 1 through 6, and it's very handy for, fractions and all that, which ties into the 360 degrees of our whole geometry system for measuring angles is based on multiples of, 60 and 6. And it's kind of this curious coincidence that nobody really seems to explore too much, like why that would be. It just so happens that measuring the sun is done in degrees, and we get that. But the other thing I wondered about is the fact that is the stars being a part of this calendar system, and even in the book of Job, it mentions several of the constellations of the zodiac, which seemingly suggests that that's part of God's original design. These 12 houses. So, throughout astronomy and astrology, it's always divided into the zodiac. It's this common thing that everyone around the world was using, which ties into the 12 months of the year. And so even the hexadecimal system, I would say, is, if God created these 12 constellations to be easily recognizable in the sky from each other, I mean, think about that. And that's not to get into whether, the whole gospel is written in the zodiac. I never really was too jazzed about that whole idea for whatever reason, but I'm not poo-pooing it either. But the fact that there are 12 constellations and those constellations seem to be part of the original design is interesting. Like, how much have we actually taken credit for that God just put right in front of us from day one? Not to mention the earth that gives us food and the animals that do work for us and provide us with food and clothing, and the trees that grow from the ground, and then you cut them down and they turn into this material that can be used both as fuel and as a material that you can fashion into a zillion different shapes and other tools to make more tools. I mean, everything that we have built and created and figured out goes back to relying on these basic fundamental provisions of creation. It's amazing how much we just have, by refusing to acknowledge the Creator, have come up with narrative after narrative after narrative as to why all these things that are just, the sun and the moon being the exact same size in the sky, that's just a coincidence. There couldn't be a creator behind that. How much of our thinking has been warped by stuff like this? Not just imagining this vast vacuum. It's almost hard for me to even comprehend these days. The more I think about it, like, where you're out and about and going, are people really just going about their day and imagining just a few hundred miles above their heads is just this giant, endless vacuum zooming by? Like, is that really factoring into our daily psychology in ways that we just can't even... I think so.
We speak of time as though it's something real, the kind of thing that you can package and promote and put out in some kind of physical way. But in fact, time is really an abstraction. It's a concept. It's an idea that our brains use in order to do something much more fundamental, and that is deal with the real things that confront us. Those are events. It's events that we find happening around us, and we organize those events in sequence according to a principle that we happen to call time.
When I speak of time, gentlemen, I'm referring to the fourth dimension.
Without clocks, without watches, we couldn't have evolved at all. We would collide with each other.
If man had no timekeeping, everything would happen all at once. We'd plant crops in the middle of the dry season, and we'd go hungry, and we would have all died out somewhere about 1.5 million years ago.
For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to every one that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen.
To me, the whole issue of time, and tying into my last video, and the whole concept of dysphoria, the dysphoria related to the time, what is this time that we are actually living in? That kind of feels like the question I've been grappling with since even encountering 9/11 truth, or whatever, back in 2010, and I think even a decade before that, so 20 plus years of just quickly starting to feel like I might be living in a time quite different than what I had presumed. And everyone kind of goes through different things to get them to that point, and at different times in their life and in different generations and everything. But it's amazing how similar it really is. I think that underlying temporal dysphoria, if you will, it's a very strange thing to try and kind of articulate and even understand in my own mind. I don't know. In 2020, for instance, it was a strange year in the way it just made me kind of think back and remember and compare, like, how are we in this place as a world, as a society, as people in your own family and friend circles and everything, and seeing all this going on and just feeling like you're in some Twilight Zone movie, going, how is this happening with people I've known, your whole life, and like we're in a bad movie. And the kind of questions that you hear a lot of people asking, whether it's about, COVID and the mass psychosis of that, or everything that's kind of flipped on in the past 5 to 10 years with identity politics and critical race theory, critical gender theory, cancel culture, people who were like liberal their whole lives now suddenly going like, how am I being called a white supremacist? And what the heck is really going on? You just hear a lot of people kind of coming to that place one way or another and trying to really wrap their heads around, like, how has the world gone completely insane in so many ways? And I find myself wondering a lot of the time, how much of all these topics that are considered crazy conspiracy subjects that people don't want to go there, Like, how much is it ever really about accepting the horror of the crime itself, whether it's like a false flag attack of some kind, or, you know, maybe something not being as safe and effective as it's made out to be, or, you know, the idea that they faked the moon landings and maybe a whole lot more, and maybe every picture you've ever seen of the globe in your life. How much of it is really about that specific question or event? Or is it really about the implications of living in a world that is that deceived and controlled and captured and on the precipice of, tyranny, the likes of which we've only ever really explored in dystopian science fiction and such? Is that really the thing that puts people off? Or more to the point, are we actually really living in some kind of biblical end time run-up, you know? Regardless of how close we might actually be to a 7-year tribulation period, or, you know, whatever your eschatology might allow you to consider, just the idea of like that we could really be living in unprecedented times compared to the rest of all of human history is itself, I don't know, it's a pretty heavy thing to really have to process, to really have to absorb that. And even, it's weird, like, I did listen to that speech that Tucker Carlson gave at the Heritage Foundation, and you know, it was interesting to just kind of watch all that unfold, you know, from a kind of like a historical, like, this is amazing that all of this is happening, and here he is talking to these, you know, conservative people who are all buying into his. He said something about how, like, his generation of people, or the older generation, like, so many people today, like, can't really even, you can show them what's happening, you can, you know, talk about it till you're blue in the face, but they can't really metabolize it. That's the word he used. And I was like, that's a pretty, that kind of sums up a lot of what you're constantly dealing with on all kinds of fronts. And then, of course, he turns around and he's going to Twitter, and I don't think we need to surmise too much more about how far that's going to go. So that didn't take very long to kind of suss out. And Twitter's new CEO, and hello. So maybe the Flat Earthers have been telling you what's up with Elon Musk for a long time, and you know, you got to give us that much at least. But yeah, being able to absorb that on whatever level, you know, regardless of what shape you even think the Earth is, to metabolize the times that we are living in, it is kind of, I don't know that I'll ever be done trying to wrap my head around, you know, like how weird it is. And it really is. I was a kid in 1985 when, you know, that stinking movie came out, and 85, like the apex of this decade of, as a kid, it was kind of, you know, optimism and innocence and simpler times in so many ways, even though it was, you know, it was no more innocent than any other time in history, really. Part of growing up is just learning, like, how naive you were to so much of what was going on around you. But just the idea that, like, that whole Back to the Future movie just is a perfect illustration of how, by the time I was alive in the 80s, the 50s and 60s seemed like ancient history. It was in the history books. It was like we'd already come out of all the craziness, and it was just the Berlin Wall came down, and we're just gonna drink Coke. And how weird is it that the whole 20th century almost was kind of, every decade somehow had its own schemata of archetypes and associations, such that, like, every 10 years it's like, oh yeah, we just went through another cultural revolution, just by nature of, that's how decades work now, because we're in the 20th century, and progress and change, and then we move into the 90s, and now we're moving into the internet age, and how cool is this going to be? And then here we are, and you're, you know, the age that your parents were way back then, and looking back at it and going, are we really here? Is this really happening? Did we really actually experience life without taking a cell phone everywhere you go? I mean, how many times have you stopped and thought about that, old people? Life before cell phones, and all the ways that has impacted our families and children and marriages and day-to-day life and ability to even, you know, I've definitely become one of those people who does not celebrate post-cellular life. And yet we're all participating in it, and that's kind of the whole tension, the whole reason that people don't want to hear that, like, yeah, the system is not here to bring about peace, justice, and freedom of speech, but yeah, it's the beast system being assembled over generations, more generations than we can probably conceive of. And here we are staring down the barrel of central bank digital currencies and medical passports, and even the idea of, technologies under the skin that maybe we can't even metabolize in our minds that they would even really do such a thing. But speaking of which, I did come across this guy, Michael O'Fallon, and he has a Sovereign Nations channel, and he's done a bunch of collaboration with James Lindsay, who I've also been listening to, trying to kind of grasp this whole dialectic aspect of critical theory and, Marxism and DEI and all this stuff. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Lindsay, but O'Fallon, he's got this podcast, and this one episode in particular called We Are Data. He kind of goes into what I'm waffling about in terms of, nanotech applications, potential nanotech applications in the beast system, to a degree that I don't think I've really heard anyone else out there really delve into, at least from a Christian perspective. So yeah, it's kind of a side note, but the times that we are living in. When I was in my 20s and first having kids and trying to figure that out and everything, the last thing I imagined I would be doing 20 years later was reading Karl Marx and Hegel and listening to Dr. James Lindsay and other guys. Like, for instance, this Mere Simulacrity conference. It's like a 12-part series on this channel as well that numerous speakers were contributing to. I think I listened to most of them, so very worthwhile. But yeah, I've been listening to a lot of guys like Lindsay and just a whole kind of variety of things delving into. Lindsay's interesting because he's just an interesting character in himself. I'm going on a tangent here, but it'll all tie together, don't worry. Just the dialectic, and because he ties, Marxism directly back to Hegel, and Marx just using Hegel's dialectic in a materialistic way, dialectical materialism, and all the fundamentals of communism flowing out of that in a way. But so he ties it back to Hegel, and Hegel, he's kind of realized that this is all Gnosticism, and it goes back to the Hermetic writings and the Hermetic tradition. So essentially, yeah, Hegel was a wizard, a Hermeticist, and basically all of this dialectical thought and dialectical philosophy traces back to Hermeticism, and that in itself going back to ancient Greece. Of course, the dialectic goes back to Socrates and Plato, and this whole idea of it's a conversation, a dialogue between two people, and the idea is that, again, once you remove God from the equation and you're just turning to human philosophy to try and find truth and find meaning and figure out everything about the world, it's human-centered. Dialogue is the method. We're just gonna, we have no one else. There's no God to reveal things, so man is left with himself, and so the dialectic, it kind of makes sense that this whole system of thought would arise out of that. Of course, it was a polytheistic culture originally, but it's the same thing. It's when there's no exterior, objective creator God, biblical God, polytheism and pantheism and humanism are all kind of one and the same, ultimately. So, yeah, very interesting that James Lindsay has traced the dialectic back to Hermes and Hermeticism and alchemy and all this stuff, because indeed, this is what I think a lot of these things that we've kind of pinpointed in scientism all trace themselves back to the mystery schools and back to humanistic philosophy. And the interesting thing about James Lindsay is that not being a believer, I don't know if he would call himself an atheist or an agnostic, but he's definitely kind of painted himself into a corner with his research and findings, I would argue. But so I pray that he finds the God who's really the only foundation for any of the truths that he's trying to defend and argue for. If classical liberalism is basically the scaffolding that you're clinging to, but still in a universe that just exploded out of nothing and was created by no one and has evolved over billions of years according to no intention or thought or design, then the whole thing is just a big waste of time conversation in my view. And I kind of find that more and more with just about anything having to do with all of this, social upheaval, the culture war, the politics, all this stuff. Like, if you can't begin and end the conversation with, is there a God? Then yeah, you're forcing yourself into a humanistic dialectic where inevitably the options that you're given to choose from, the two sides are always going to be skewed it's always going to be a false framing of whatever the topic is, whether it's about human behavior or morality, technology, whatever. I mean, the very idea that ideologies, whether they're like Marxist or Maoist or techno-rainbow, transhumanist, whatever, all of these things that are essentially built on the foundation of Darwinism and evolutionary cosmology, and that just being assumed scientific fact that you can't even argue with, they all inevitably make moral arguments against their detractors. Marxism is all about accusing the bourgeoisie of oppressing the proletariat. There's always this oppressor and oppressed polarity and all these different forms of Marxist thought. And so the struggle, the whole man is left to then fight it out, basically. And you have to synthesize all these polarities, because there really is no good or bad in an evolutionary universe. Those are all just illusions, and yet you're appealing to morality in order to eradicate morality, ultimately, which is a very cyclical, snake eating its own tail kind of thing, which is interesting that Lindsay does actually connect a lot of things about the occult, like just the idea that it's like, hey, this is a cult, this is a religion. It's kind of dawning on a lot of different people out there. It's just kind of amazing to hear that being like pointed out by people who don't even believe in God. So it's like, yes, indeed, this is a cult. This giant Gnostic, intellectual, materialistic / mystical, evolutionary, anything but the God of the Bible cult. Yep. It's really like kind of taken over the world, and has in many ways, at least in terms of institutional capture, governmental or academic or corporate, and the scale of that being something that, again, can you or I, any regular person, it's hard to really imagine what that world is even like, and yet there are more and more people being confronted with all these demands of, pronouns and DEI protocols and whatnot being enforced in the workplace and in government. I mean, it's pretty astounding to really kind of look at it as something it's not new. There's nothing new under the sun, and yet the speed at which the evolutionary mindset has now kind of transformed into, social justice, social change, social revolution, in a way that even the Marxists of the past and the feminists of my generation and the gay and lesbian rights activists of my generation don't even know how to make heads or tails of it. It's just complete insanity. And so many people kind of want to just figure out, how do we go back to the golden age of classical liberalism, or the golden age of, whatever it is in your mind, the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, if you whatever period of human history that seems like was pretty good. For all the things that we don't know that lie ahead, and all the questions we might still wrestle with, knowing that you have to let it go. You do have to let go of longing for some snapshot of society that existed in your mind or in your life or in history that could never be found again, and to just be here today, but knowing that it's not just going to keep going on and on forever. But I think that's a hard, I don't want to say hard sell, but a hard truth to metabolize. The Lord could tarry another 100 years, and we could live, we could experience communism in a way that we just never thought would be possible. A digital technocracy that operates on a whole new level of surveillance and algorithmic analysis of human behavior. It just amazes me that we actually have, in the midst of all this stuff that we've built and made and supposedly figured out, we still have the Word of God preserved for hundreds and hundreds of years through scribes and scrolls and human, librarians. God gave it to us before we had the printing press, before we had digital media, parts of it going all the way back to Moses, and then by oral tradition all the way back to Noah and Adam himself, and then the book of Genesis. No one could know any of that had God not told us. Had he not told Adam and Eve. It's weird to think that the internet might be the closest thing to a time machine that any of us could experience, and yet we are the generation that lived through this bizarre time where suddenly we could go back and look at clips from films and TV and rewatch the propaganda, which for so many decades it was like you watched it when it was being broadcast. And after that, it was really easy to memory hole something after it aired. And suddenly we're living in this time where this brief window, really, as that window is now being rapidly closed down more and more, where we had access to more information than you could possibly even read or watch or absorb. And going round and round, wondering like, how much of this is a blessing and how much of it is a curse? Or how could it be kind of both at the same time? At the same time, a vehicle of God's judgment and also a vehicle of His grace. Or not just the internet, but the whole era that we live in. I think ultimately you can be terrified by the idea that sooner or later, civilization, history will come to a close. All the books that were written, all the movies that were filmed, all the content that was ever created will not endure on into eternity. But the Word of God and the children of God, family of God, the bride of Christ, the New Jerusalem, the heavenly inheritance. We can be complete in Christ here and now, but also knowing that we'll never experience the fullness of it in this world, in this life. Regardless of where we are in the great timeline of history and how close to the Antichrist we may be, if you're willing to even consider that. One thing is for sure is that the cycle of time ends for all of us, and we never know when it will be. But God knows. And there's like an amazing amount of comfort in knowing that it's not going to be any sooner or later than He's decreed. And every day that we're given is supposed to be a day that we give back to Him in whatever sacrificial way we can. And I don't know, it's good to be reminded of that, I think, because it's so easy to just get wrapped up in all the dialectics. All the debates between men, where God isn't even allowed in the conversation.
Michael J. Fox. For the next 1/24th of a day, for the next 3,600 seconds, for the next 60 minutes, for the next exciting hour, you and I are going to go time traveling together. We'll turn the pages of some timeless literature, and we'll relive some famous plot-stopping moments from the movies, too.
said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day.